Welcome to the Hardytown Baptist Church website. Technology has allowed churches everywhere to reach people worldwide. Through the internet, we are able to spread the message of Christ to a new audience. Recently, we have added a new feature to our website called Ask the Pastor. We encourage you to submit questions to us, and we will provide clear, concise, biblical answers to some of life's toughest questions. Many people have knowledge of who Moses was as related to the Bible. Someone has asked, was anyone saved prior to the laws of Moses? This question will be answered by Pastor Noah Rollerson, Associate Pastor and Minister of Students here at Hardytown Baptist Church.
The question's been raised today whether or not people or anyone could get saved before the coming of the law of Moses is found in Exodus. And to answer that question, we really need to look at the nature of salvation and the nature of God. But first of all, let me just go ahead and tell you that yes, people were saved and brought into right relationship with God before the law of Moses. Let's just think about this for a second. Let's think about the people that were righteous and in right standing with God before the law of Moses found in Exodus. So we have to look at Genesis. Adam and Eve repented of their sin. Abel was righteous. Enoch, the patriarch in Genesis, was so righteous that God took him and didn't allow him to die. The text says that Enoch walked and was no more, that God simply took him. Noah was the only righteous man on the earth and his family. Let's look at Abraham, whom God put into covenant with, his sons, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, all his children, his descendants rather, and look at their lives and see how righteous and walked with God that they did. So it's hard to imagine a scenario where these people, these great patriarchs of the faith, could not be in fellowship with God before the coming of the law in Exodus. So we have to keep in mind first that they were great and godly individuals before the coming of the law found in Exodus. Secondly, we need to look at the nature of salvation itself. Salvation has always been by grace through faith alone in God. And this is not just a New Testament thing, this is an Old Testament thing. Genesis 15:6 says this, that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him or counted to him as righteousness. He was in right standing with God. Whenever you see the word righteous in the Bible, it is a legal term. To be in right standing, to be in good standing, to not be at enmity or at conflict with God. So Abraham believed, and because of his faith, it was credited to him righteousness, or what we would refer to as salvation, right standing with the Lord. Paul, in talking about salvations in the book of Romans and in the book of Galatians, quotes this verse. He quotes it more than once to say that salvation is by grace through faith alone in God. Now, we as Christians put our faith in Jesus Christ, looking back on what he did at the cross 2,000 years ago. Old Testament people were saved by putting their faith in the promise of the coming Messiah and believing in the words of God the Father. So salvation has always been the same, although we look back on the work of Christ, whereas Old Testament saints looked forward to the coming of the promised Messiah. So salvation has not changed from the Old Testament and New Testament. It is essentially has always been the same. And lastly, we need to look at the nature of God. When God gave Moses the Old Testament laws and the law of Moses, God didn't automatically just gain his morality at Mount Sinai with Moses. God has always been who he is. He's always been moral. He's always been righteous. And we learn in Genesis that humans, since creation, have always been accountable to God for their sin and for their righteousness and their accountability towards him. Adam and Eve were accountable. The whole world was accountable when God flooded it. Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and all these patriarchs of the Old Testament had to reconcile their sin with God before the law of Moses ever came. So God gave Moses the law for the Israelites at Mount Sinai because of the hardness of men's hearts, because he knew they weren't getting it. So he put it in written form so they would have a standard and a reference that they could go back to, the Ten Commandments and the Levitical laws and all these things. So we don't need to think that morality and the law and goodness and sin started with Moses at Sinai. It's been in the mind of God since eternity past, and since the creation of man, we've been accountable to God for our actions. So in short, yes, people were saved and brought into right standing with God before the giving of the law in Exodus.